Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for 114, Unit 2. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about moral theories. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of moral philosophy and how to do it, and we're going to do this by looking a little bit about what kinds of things we actually going to look at when we try and approach it moral problems and moral questions. So what we're going to do today is we'll dig into that a little bit. We're going to give a sort of an overview of the philosophical terrain of the basic categories of moral theories, of which the two biggest families will be ones that we'll worry about. And then we'll also look a little bit at how to evaluate these kinds of things. What kind of criteria should we be using when we judge one theory or perspective to be better or worse at doing the jobs that we want moral theories to do? So let's get to it, shall we? Now, if you remember, we started off the last lecture with an introduction, with a story, really, about trolley problems, where we introduced this idea of there are certain moral problems that, especially when we start trying to compare differences between them, we have a hard time rationalizing or explaining what's different between these three pictures. Because what's obvious in one case, that we say should sacrifice one to save many, is no longer nearly as obvious if we look at pushing the fat man off the bridge or dealing with a homicidal or bloodthirsty doctor who's willing to do anything to save lives. And the real question wasn't just, well, what should I do in each of these cases? Because we had answers for that. The trick was trying to explain what was different between them. Why were each of these things the right or wrong thing to do? And what's going on that makes these three cases different? And the way that we deal with that sort of thing is by offering some sort of a moral theory, and at least we do in philosophy. Now, for our purposes, moral theories are explanations of what makes an action either right or wrong or good or bad. And that's going to include theories both about obligation, right and wrong, as well as theories of value. So moral theories are the kind of explanation that we're looking for when we try and compare these different cases. It's not just somebody's perspective, oh, it's perfectly fine to throw the switch in the first case, you shouldn't push the fat man, and you shouldn't tear somebody up for spare parts. It's not enough just to simply say, I think these things are right and wrong. Instead, moral theories are all about explaining what makes that action right or wrong. Similarly, we might have explanations of why different actions are good or bad, or what makes a person good or bad. In another class, I've done units on the definition of evil and what sort of criteria should we use when we apply the concept of evil to a person or to an action. So moral theories, or at least the ones that we're going to deal with, are primary explanations about these kinds of things, rather than just opinions or viewpoints. I know a lot of y'all probably ended up signing up for this class thinking that you'd end up reading a whole lot of perspectives and viewpoints on different problems. Or if you've taken an in-person philosophy class, you may have enjoyed discussing a lot of different viewpoints. And that is very much what we do. But when we really are trying to tackle these things, it's not enough just to have a perspective. We need to actually have explanations behind our perspectives and be able to identify the individual aspects of things that make them right or wrong. Now, similarly, moral theories, or at least the sport that we deal with, are things that don't focus on individual actions or rules. So when we talk about moral theories, we're not talking about, say, the idea that it's perfectly fine to kill one to save many. Instead, we're looking more at the explanation of, well, it's fine to kill someone in this, it's fine to throw the switch in this case, because what makes an action right are the consequences. The amount of good that you produce with an action is what determines whether it's right or wrong. That's a moral theory. Simply stating, I think that it's right in this case to do this, again, isn't the kind of thing that we're looking for or dealing with. So moral theories generally aren't going to be the sorts of things to focus on individual actions or rules. Those sorts of much more particular ideas are what we might refer to as a moral principle or something being part of a moral code. Generally, we'll look to moral principles as our explanations there. It might be a moral principle that killing people is wrong, or that self-defense is perfectly fine. Those are examples of moral principles, but they're not examples of theories. Instead, theories focus on what makes something right or wrong in general. One example that we will talk briefly about, but not in great detail, is the concept of divine command theory. And this is the theory that what makes an action right is whether or not it coincides with what God wants us to do, that if it coincides with a divine command. Some versions of it even say that something can only be right if God actively told us to do it. And a few of you are probably having some immediate emotional and instinctual reactions to that, either in favor of it or against it, but that's beside the point. Divine command theory is a nice example of the kind of thing that we refer to as a moral theory. It explains what makes something right and wrong, but on its own, it doesn't actually tell us what is right or wrong. That's what the job of applied ethics and figuring out the applications of our various moral theories are for. It's also worth noting that moral theories are not the same as moral arguments. They work together with them. And usually, if you have a moral theory, you have arguments to back it up. But remember that an argument is literally just a set of statements that supports another claim, or tries to establish the truth of some other claim. Moral theories often rely on arguments and work well with them, but they are not themselves on their own arguments. So a moral theory can't be valid or invalid or sound or unsound. Those aren't concepts that apply well to moral theories. So try and make sure we don't mix up our vocabulary and our different tools when we talk about this stuff. Now, in moral philosophy, when we're dealing with moral theories, there are two very broad umbrellas that moral theories in particular can fall under, especially when we're dealing just with normative ethics. Meta-ethics has its own stuff, and applied ethics is, of course, far more diverse. But when we deal with moral theories, we can usually classify theories as either being consequentialist or non-consequentialist. Consequentialist theories explain right and wrong in terms of the consequences of an action. They look at what kinds of results come from the doing of a particular task. And most of these will end up saying that the amount of good that the action produces is what explains whether or not it's right or wrong. And what they mean by good may be very different from theory to theory. One of the classic examples of all this sort of thing, of consequentialist theories, is what's called utilitarianism, which we'll look at a little bit more detail in just a second. But in general, utilitarianism says that the right thing to do is the one that produces the most happiness. Whereas ethical egoism is also a consequentialist theory, where it says that you ought to do the action that produces the most good, but it focuses on the good just for you. What benefits you the most? That's what you ought to do, the ethical egoist says. So even though both theories have the same sort of structure to them, and they fall under the same general umbrella of being consequentialist theories, they're very different. It's also worth noting that there is no singular consequentialism. You can't say, well, consequentialism says this about a problem. That's not the way we use or apply the term. Instead, this is an umbrella term that different variety of theories fall under. And all of the ones under this umbrella say that right and wrong is explained by the consequences of an action. And we can look to those consequences to determine whether something's right or wrong. Now, this is opposed rather naturally by non-consequentialist theories. Now, these theories explain right or wrong in terms of some other feature of an action besides the consequences. And this is a very big umbrella because non-consequentialist theories look to a lot of different things. Some theories look to intentions, some look to whether or not they match up with moral rules, some will look to other sorts of moral principles or some other fact about a situation. And a lot of these theories will include consequences in their explanations, but they never take it as the main or only explanation for why an action's right or wrong, or why something's good or bad. And here, one of the best examples is Kant's theory of morality, sometimes called Kantian ethics. Other examples might be something like natural law theory or divine command theory that we already mentioned. So there's a lot of variety over here as well. But in general, they all share the common feature of looking to something besides the consequences to explain right and wrong. Now, We'll see some of these different views in action later on in the semester, and your book goes into a bit more detail on several of the examples listed of each different type. But for the most part, I'm not all that worried about whether or not you know every detail of those theories, especially since there's so many of them thrown at you at once, and you see really just a paragraph or two's explanation of them when there are volumes and volumes written on these different things. But I would like you to be aware of at least the best examples of these general kinds, because they're the ones that are going to get referenced the most when we look at specific moral problems when we go through the rest of the semester. So, as I mentioned, the most classic consequentialist view is what's called utilitarianism. The most common version specifically is what's called act utilitarianism, which focuses on evaluating actions as being either right or wrong based on whether or not they produce the greatest amount of good. And furthermore, utilitarianism defines goodness in terms of happiness and well being. So, this is the kind of theory that explains the Spur case, very well, or it gives a very clear application and explanation of what's going on in that Spur, that first trolley problem. Because in that first trolley problem, most of us want to say that throwing the switch is perfectly fine, or even that you ought to throw the switch. And the simple answer is, well, because that's going to save more lives. This is the way that the utilitarian thinks, that utilitarianism argues. They say that, well, the right thing to do is the one that produces the most amount of good, that is going to produce the greatest amount of happiness. And 5 people being alive adds for a whole lot more happiness than simply allowing 1 to be. So, you ought to try and save as many lives as you can. Now, the non-consequentialist example that gives a very different sort of picture is Kantian ethics. That is, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant's theory of morality. Now, Kant argued that actions are only right if they act in accordance with what he called the categorical imperative, which is a moral principle about acting according to certain sorts of standards, namely things like acting in ways that can be treated as a universal law, something that can apply to everyone. Kant believed and argued in a very detailed set of books that if you try and act on some sort of moral principle or some sort of moral rule, if you can't rationally apply it to everyone, it's really not a good candidate for being considered moral. And this is where we can look at stuff like the Fat Man example. In the Fat Man version of the trolley problem, most of us want to say, no, it's wrong to push the fat man. And we might give a variety of reasons why. We might say, oh, it's wrong to physically push the guy. To put my hands on him is a step too far. And we might wonder, well, why is that too much? Like, why is that a big deal? Why is it wrong to physically push this guy when throwing the lever was fine in the other case? And Kant may say something like, well, pushing the fat man, or saying that it's okay to push the fat man, isn't really a rule that you can apply universally to every person. If you do that, you're going to get certain sorts of inconsistencies, because you're going to get situations where it's very much not okay. And you're going to get situations where we can't accept the kinds of results that come from that expansion. For example, we might start having a world where nobody trusts each other anymore, where we start breaking down society because we're all afraid of getting pushed off of bridges at the slightest convenience. They might also argue that doing so disrespects our fundamental humanity and dignity, which is another aspect of the categorical imperative. You ought to only act in ways that treat people as people, not things, not just as tools to use to accomplish your goals. And so Kant would say it's not the results of the fat man situation that make the act right or wrong, because the results are the same as in the first case. Instead, what makes that action different from the first one is the fact that that action's not in accordance with this bigger, more important moral principle, this other idea that he argues that we ought to try and live by. And because the action doesn't match up with that principle, that's the reason that it's wrong to push the fat man, but it's perfectly fine, say, to throw the switch in the first case. But Kant would actually probably argue that one. So those are a couple of examples for the biggest types of theories and a little bit of an idea of what it is that moral theories do. And we're going to see a wide variety of these kinds of theories as we move through the rest of the semester. We're going to see a lot of different points and perspectives and explanations of what's going on in the different individual moral problems we talk about, starting with problems involving the morality of warfare next unit. But since we have so many competing views, we need to have ways of evaluating and comparing them. As I mentioned before, moral theories aren't arguments. They have arguments, and we can criticize the arguments. But we also need ways to evaluate the theory itself, things that are different from the ways that we evaluate arguments. So our book suggests 3 different criteria that we use to evaluate moral theories. The first of which is whether or not that theory is consistent with our considered judgments. That is, when we look at a moral theory, when we look at an explanation of why something's right or wrong, we need that theory, or it's only a good theory if it fits in well with the other things that we've already decided and thought about and figured out. If you've been, well, let's take it as fairly obvious that it's wrong to inflict pointless suffering on people. That seems like a pretty safe moral assumption. It's wrong to pointlessly torture somebody or inflict suffering on them, just for no benefit or reason whatsoever. If you have a moral theory, if somebody proposes a moral theory or an explanation that clashes with that idea, then maybe it's the theory we should throw out. Because the idea that it's wrong to inflict suffering just because seems like a pretty safe and solid judgment. It seems like we've got a lot of good reasons for supporting that idea. So any theory that clashes with it, that's a major cost to adopting that theory. And so it's a good reason to not accept it, to not believe it as the actual and real explanation of what's going on. Similarly, we want our moral theories to be consistent with our moral experiences. If a moral theory implies something about morality that we know isn't true, or that doesn't fit well with our experience of it, then that also is a reason to reject it. Take, for example, take some theory that implies that we're never wrong about moral problems, that we are completely infallible when it comes to moral judgments. Whatever we think about a given problem, that's the right answer. That doesn't really fit well with our experience of doing moral stuff. We know that sometimes we're wrong, and all of us have experiences of being wrong about some moral question or another. And so if a theory doesn't fit well with that, again, we've got a good reason for rejecting that theory. Excuse me. We might also look at whether or not a theory is useful for actually solving moral problems. Moral theories are supposed to be explanations of right and wrong. They're supposed to tell us why certain things are right and certain things aren't. And so they need to actually help us solve real world problems. They need to help explain and deal with actual situations in the world. And so we might take it as a bare minimum requirement for a theory to be able to do that. If a theory can't actually tell us anything, if it doesn't actually inform our decisions and our ability and our engagement with moral problems, then really it's not a very good theory. It's not doing its job very well. It's not explaining things in a way that's useful or informative for us. And so again, we might have good reasons for rejecting the theory then. Each of these 3 perhaps isn't enough on its own to automatically accept a theory, but they do definitely give us reasons for rejecting some. And they also give us things to consider whenever we're evaluating one theory or another. Now, as we move through the rest of the semester, we're going to look at, as I said, several different theories as they apply to the different problems we talk about. But our main focus is going to be on specific moral problems as opposed to full-on theories. So this stuff isn't just useless vocabulary. It is going to show up again. And so to help give us a little bit of practice at this sort of thing, as well as answer a very fundamental question for us, or at least examine a very fundamental question for us, in the next lecture, we're going to look at a few meta-ethical theories about whether or not these kinds of theories and explanations can actually be correct in the same way that a scientific theory or explanation might be. We need to know whether or not there are right answers to moral problems. But we'll do that in the next lecture and in the next reading. If you guys haven't already, start taking a look at your journals and the checklist and what they ask of you. I highly recommend waiting to do the journals until after the next lecture, since that's the material that they mostly draw from. But you might still consider at least doing Journal 3, I think, at this point. But either way, good luck.